Hi, I'm Jeffrey, and this is AutoAlchemy, the intersection between typology and self-growth. If you don't know, I'm an ENTP, and hey, maybe you are too. There's only one way to find out. So if you're watching this video, you're probably wondering, how can I know if I'm an ENTP? Either that, or you just so happen to like my content, in which case, thank you. So if you're in the former camp, you've probably taken the 16 personalities test or some equivalent, and you've received those 4 magnificent letters ENTP. Or maybe you watched my ENTP rap and thought, hey, this kind of seems like me. Either way, you now find yourself here on this video plagued with at least a little uncertainty about which box you happen to fit in. And the truth is, determining our type is actually less easy than we tend to think it is. Here's why. So first of all, these online tests that we're all familiar with aren't really that consistent, and they don't do justice to the complex phenomenon that is a human being. One day you're supposedly an ENTP, and then the next day you are suddenly an INTJ, which can only happen because these tests are equating these higher level behaviors with more fundamental cognitive processes. The former behaviors actually have a lot of plasticity, whereas I would argue that this is less so the case with the fundamental processes. Complication number 2 is that it's actually pretty hard to see yourself clearly. There's a lot of truth in that idea that fish don't know that they're in water. When you're surrounded by something or submerged in something like an intuitive thought process, then you can kind of become desensitized to it and then become more inclined to notice things that actually break your standard mode of being. So you might be taking a personality test and remembering how well you just cleaned your room and then systematized your bookshelf, and you might think, yeah, I'm a sensor, despite the fact that this is the first time you've cleaned your room in a decade. A final complication is the idea of intra-type variation, which is variation within a type. So while I do think the system has a lot of room to grow, I am actually a big fan of the objective personality system for this very reason. It does such a good job of capturing the full spectrum of type variation. And in their system, there are actually 32 different varieties of ENTPs. So you could take one ENTP and then find another ENTP that is, for all intents and purposes, the opposite ENTP within that spectrum of ENTPs. But enough about differences, let's talk about what all ENTPs have in common. That way you can determine once and for all whether or not you're just a pretender. If that last comment hurt your feelings, then you're probably an INFP. I'm just kidding, of course. So the first thing that all ENTPs have in common is an overwhelming preference for extroverted intuition over introverted sensing. A fundamental principle of typology is the notion of binary coins. For whatever reason, consciousness seems to require the tension between 2 opposing poles, and we unthinkingly end up preferring one pole while disregarding the other. In objective personality terms, one is a savior function while the other is a demon function. One of them strikes you as containing all of the answers to the universe's questions, while the other is better left ignored or outsourced. So yeah, for the ENTP, this coin of extroverted intuition versus introverted sensing is going to be their greatest cognitive chasm. And you could think of that as a sort of abstract expansion contrasted with a concrete sensory narrowing. ENTPs deeply need the freedom to move through various possibilities, whether that's through exploring every philosophy under the sun or, in a more silly way, just playing with ideas. And they're going to experience concrete, tangible reality as this cage which limits them and prevents them from being the pioneer of ideas that they long to be. Which is why my videos emphasize complication, by the way. I don't want to give people simple answers. I want to give them tools that they can use for exploring and expanding. As a side note, if you are on the abstract side but prefer narrowing as opposed to expanding, then you're likely seeking out the comfort and security of a single abstract container, such as an ideology or a single worldview, in which case you might actually be an INTJ or an INFJ. I got tangents within tangents over here. So the second thing that all ENTPs share is the same rational axis. Because knowing that you lead with extroverted intuition isn't actually enough. ENFPs also lead with extroverted intuition, so to clarify further, you actually need to understand the nature of your judging/deciding functional axis. And this axis is going to be nested within the axis of the intuition and the sensing. So ENTPs are going to be on the introverted thinking, extroverted feeling axis, while ENFPs are going to be on the introverted feeling, extroverted thinking axis. This means that for the ENTP, logic and rationality are personal, while values and emotions are shared or collective. Conversely, the ENFP lives in a world where it's actually the logic that is shared, while values and emotions are personal/private. With extroverted thinking, an ENFP might solve a problem with the first tool that they're given, provided it doesn't violate some value of theirs. Meanwhile, for the ENTP, there's a danger of trying to solve a problem from scratch, trying to reinvent the wheel within the confines of their own skull. By the way, according to Objective Personality, about half of the ENTPs out there are going to have a preference for introverted thinking, while the other half will have a preference for extroverted feeling. So some ENTPs will lean in a more stereotypical, logical direction, while others will be more communal and more value-oriented. They'll kind of be hippies. Either way, the difference of magnitude between those middle two functions is going to be way more subtle than the chasm between extroverted intuition and introverted sensing. So anyway, hopefully that gives you some framework for what an ENTP actually is beneath all of the obnoxious stereotypes. So the last thing that you're going to need to determine whether or not you're an ENTP is honesty. As I mentioned before, we don't really see ourselves clearly. So you actually need to examine yourself and your behaviors and your underlying motivations in a very clear-headed, sober kind of way. You need to look at your life with an eye for what is compulsive, look for where you enter a flow state, look for where you're operating very calmly and responsibly. And then you need to cross-check that by looking for the corresponding opposite. These are the demon functions, the functions that stress you out, or the functions that you have to strain for, or more deceptively, the ones that you peacock whenever you're feeling a little big-headed, like me. Determining your personality type is more like working with a Sudoku than anything else. It's a puzzle where you need to take your time and do those cross-checks. But hey, thankfully ENTPs often like cracking puzzles. Well, that's it. Thank you so much for tuning into AutoAlchemy. Thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. I'll catch you guys next time. Adios.